Getting hired for six-figure positions is actually very easy once you stop answering questions with absolute honesty. And after helping more than 250 executives land six-figure roles, I've seen the brutal truth. Interviews aren't about honest answers. They're about judgment. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to answer questions in a way that builds confidence fast, so that your interviews finally convert into six-figure offers. Okay, so first, let's talk about why absolute honesty actually hurts you in an interview. And it's because interviews aren't confession booths, they're courtrooms. In a confession booth, you reveal everything. You admit your flaws and you clear your conscience. But in a courtroom, you don't confess. You present evidence strategically. You decide what matters. You control the framing and you protect your position. You don't lie, but you don't volunteer ammunition either. And this is where even strong executives lose momentum. They give absolute honesty in every answer. So when they're asked, what's your biggest weakness? They confess, I struggle with delegation. I'm not great at conflict. I sometimes overthink my decisions. It sounds honest, but it introduces unmanaged risk. And at senior level, that unmanaged risk is expensive because companies don't hire when there's risk attached. Because you're not being assessed on your sincerity. You're being assessed on your judgment. Because interviewers are asking, can this person be trusted with complex decision making when there's pressure and trade-offs required? And your judgment, it shows up in what you share and how you structure it. Because in a courtroom, you don't just walk in and say, here's everything that could go wrong. You say, this was the situation, here was the decision I made, and that's why it made sense commercially. And this was the outcome. Because when you answer questions like this, the interviewers, their confidence in hiring you increases. And that confidence builds quickly and it compounds. Because now you don't sound like an executive trying to be liked. You sound like someone who makes decisions. And that's the person that gets backed. But now you're probably thinking, but isn't being honest important in interviews? Well, yes, but not in the way you think. Because what matters at senior level isn't raw honesty. It's judgment. Not as a buzzword, but as a behavior. And at senior level, that judgment shows up in three places. Not in what you know or how hard you worked, but in how you think. So first, it shows up in how you frame trade-offs. Because every meaningful decision at the executive level involves a trade-off. Speed versus quality, revenue versus margin, short-term delivery versus long-term stability, or even people impact versus commercial impact. Now, junior candidates, well, they're going to describe activity. But senior executives, they describe decisions. And they explain what options were available, which one they chose, what it cost, and why it was still the right call. Because that's judgment. And second, it shows up in how you show your risk awareness. When you answer a question, the interviewer is scanning for one thing. Does this person see the consequences, or do they just see the effort? Now, for example, a junior candidate will sound like this. I worked really hard to hit the deadline. Whereas a senior answer sounds like this. We had two competing priorities. Hitting the deadline meant compressing QA, which introduced operational risk. I chose to protect client delivery, but put additional monitoring in post-launch. And that answer shows awareness, trade-offs, risk management, and ownership. And third, it shows up in how you demonstrate your emotional control. Because senior decision makers don't answer defensively. They don't overshare or ramble. They answer calmly, concisely, and with structure. Because clarity under pressure is a signal. Because when you can summarize complexity cleanly, it builds confidence fast. So judgment isn't about being impressive. It's about demonstrating commercial awareness, trade-off logic, risk management, and really controlled communication. And when you combine those, you stop sounding like someone who's just applying, and you start sounding like the executive that already operates at that level. And here's a structure that I use with my executive clients. It's simple, but it completely changes how you're perceived. I call it the RJO Framework. It's risk, judgment, and outcome. And every strong interview answer contains those three elements. So let's break it down. Number one, risk. You start by acknowledging the risk in a situation. Because senior decisions always involve risk. And if your answer has no risk, it doesn't sound real. So instead of, we had a challenging project, you say, we had two competing priorities that we couldn't both win. Or there was commercial pressure to ship quickly, but quality concerns internally. And that risk, it signals the complexity. And second is judgment. Then you explain your decision and why you made it. And that's it at the core. It's not what happened, but it's why you chose what you chose and what you were optimizing for. And it sounds like this. I chose to protect revenue impact over internal deadlines. Or I prioritize long-term client retention over short-term margin. And this shows your trade-off awareness, your commercial thinking, and your ownership. Because this is exactly where I see most execs drop the ball. They really describe activity, whereas executives, they describe decisions. And number 3, outcome. Finally, you just show the result, but not just the metric, you show the consequence. What changed, what improved, or what stabilized. So for example, as a result, we retained the client and extended the contract. Or the launch was slightly compressed, but we avoided the operational downtime and we preserved the margin. Because the outcomes, they anchor your credibility. With an outcome, it sounds like leadership. Okay, so now let's apply the RJO framework to this classic question. Tell me about a big mistake you made. Now, most candidates might say this: I underestimated the timeline, but that's giving confession booth energy. Here's the RJO version. Risk. We were balancing aggressive growth targets with a limited operations team. Judgment. I chose to accelerate the rollout rather than hiring immediately, knowing it would stretch our capacity. And then outcome. We hit the revenue targets, but it exposed our process gaps. So I implemented a structured hiring plan in the following quarter. And that answer shows risk awareness, decision ownership, commercial thinking, and lessons learned. And that is judgment. So if you really take one thing from this video, it's this. Interviews at senior executive level, they're not about being honest. They're about demonstrating your decision quality. And if your answers don't show risk, judgment, and outcome, it probably sounds a bit junior. Okay, now that you understand how senior answers should work, let me show you where most executives still lose six-figure offers. Because the problem isn't talent. It's often signaling, it's framing, and it's unmanaged risk. And there are 5 mistakes I see consistently that lower the perceived seniority. So let me break them down for you in this next video.